Our program's moderator today will be Teresa Zim. Teresa is fantastic and is a Dartmouth graduate, a former Great Hearts Academy educator, and a travel enthusiast. Over the years, her knowledge of Russia has opened doors for her travel to Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and in 2022, Romania to work with Ukrainian refugees. Her most recent position is as the Senior Program Coordinator of the Critical Languages Institute at the Melikian Center at ASU. She is also an amazing PCFR member. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Emily Channell-Justice is the Director of Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard. She is a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She has pursued research on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013 to 2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. Her book, Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism, was published in 2022 by the University of Toronto Press and won the 2023 American Association of Ukrainian Studies Book Award, which is just fantastic. She's also the editor of Decolonizing Queer Experience, LGBTQ+ Narratives from Eastern Europe and Eurasia. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center's City University of New York in September of 2016 and was a Having Hearst Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor of International Studies at Miami University from 2016 to 2019. So without further ado, what you've all been waiting for, please join me in welcoming Dr. Channell-Justice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jada, and thanks to the audience, for everyone for being here, Sam for coordinating, for Vlad Sambayev for the initial invitation, and Teresa Zim. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So, of course, the theme of today's discussion is about the human costs of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I have been giving talks, kind of public talks, to libraries, schools, community centers over the past 600 days of the full-scale invasion. And each time I give a talk, I update the images that are on the opening slide to reflect something that has happened recently in Ukraine. And last week I gave a talk that featured the same image. This was a Russian attack on the village of Hroza, which is in Kharkivska region in eastern Ukraine. This is a small village that had a population, before the war, that had a population of about 300 people. And this attack killed 50 of them. They were in a cafe that was honoring a soldier of a father. The soldier was the father of one of the residents of the village, and the father had been repatriated to the village. They were going to rebury his remains in his home village, and the cafe was bombed and his entire family was killed. This is just one story of many stories about families that have been destroyed. This is a human, when I say the human cost of the invasion, I want to talk about the lives that have been lost, but I also want to talk about how the daily lives of people in Ukraine have been disrupted in innumerable ways, not just through death and destruction, but also in terms of how they can think about the future. So we know that the map of the war in Ukraine is changing every day. This is a recent one from last week. So you can see here the red parts of the map are the parts that have been occupied by Russia since the February invasion of 2022. The purple parts reflect the parts that had been occupied by Russia before February 2022. Obviously, you know, when we're looking at this map, we're also thinking about the Russian occupation having taken over much more of the Ukrainian territory, and a lot of the atrocities that we learned about came from the liberation of those territories, especially across the northern part of Ukraine. But the front line, the active front line that we can talk about today, is over 1,200 kilometers, around 745 miles of an active front line. And that is a very, very large active front line. And so that means that not only does that mean that troops are spread out across this entire front line, all the communities that are right around this front line, which largely, to some extent, or at least to some extent, are still populated by people, they are all facing a very large amount of violence, regular violence. And so when we're thinking about the kind of scale of the human costs, part of the reason for that is because of this very extensive front line. So first I want to talk a little bit about military casualties. There are more than 1 million people in the Ukrainian army at this point. The most recent one, this is actually a very difficult topic to find specific information on, because the Ukrainian armed forces don't release official figures about casualties, and we can be pretty sure that the Russian official figures are undercounts. We might also guess that the Ukrainian armed forces, that's their information in the center of the slide, the Ukrainian armed forces talking about Russian troop loss is probably at least a little bit inflated, but you can see here that they're estimating we're getting close to 300,000 Russian troops being killed, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Most recent assessments have shown that Ukrainian troop deaths are likely somewhere between 70 and 100,000, and Russian troop deaths are probably closer to 120,000. But we also need to keep in mind that the Russian army, the Russian standing army, and the number of troops on the battlefield is nearly 3 times what the Ukrainian active military is right now. And the last figures that I have are coming from April of 2023. And so we can also assume that those figures have gone up dramatically given Ukraine's counteroffensive that took place mostly over the summer. But what we really need to look at, in addition to these lives lost, is the other kinds of casualties. The reason that this war has had such devastating consequences for the military specifically is because it's very much an artillery war. There's an extensive use of mines. And so these cause amputations, very large numbers. The estimates that we have are that there are over 20,000 amputees in Ukraine alone. Again, I'm sure that that's going to grow either in response to the counteroffensive or just in the long term. But it's also very common to have severe concussions and post-concussion syndrome. And this is something that is often not immediately addressed because it is not nearly as apparent as something like an amputation. But of course, that has a lot of implications for potential post-traumatic syndrome as well. So obviously, all of these dramatic physical consequences go hand in hand with psychological trauma. That's something that Ukraine's military and armed forces is certainly suffering from. But that's also something that's true about Ukrainian society more broadly. There was a recent poll from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology that found that 78% of Ukrainians, so that's an absolute majority of Ukrainians, have a close relative or friend who was killed in the war. And so that means that basically all of Ukrainian society has been affected in some way from this war. And estimates are also now saying that there's likely to be at least 2 million veterans in Ukraine when this war is over, if we're estimating that the war will continue, for instance, through the end of this year, maybe into next year as well. And so while certainly the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian armed forces has really done obviously a fantastic job in this war, but also in the years leading up to this war, the reforms that took place in the Ukrainian armed forces were really more important than we even could have assessed until last February. That being said, the Ukrainian state, the government, has not really been prepared for a war at this scale, and therefore to have to address the issues that 2 million veterans are going to face, in addition to the civilian trauma that they're going to have to face as well. So when we talk about civilian casualties, I get most of my data from UN official statistics. I'll talk a little bit about why those aren't always exactly correct, but the confirmed numbers that the UN is sharing with us are that 9,701 civilians have been killed and 17,748 have been injured. These are confirmed instances of civilian deaths. They do not include, for example, an accurate assessment of the number of civilians who lost their lives in the city of Mariupol, which of course was devastated by Russian bombing earlier in the course of the invasion, and now is occupied by Russian forces, meaning that we may honestly never know the number of civilians that were killed there. This map shows active hostilities. It is cumulative, so this is showing hostilities that have taken place over the past 600 days. The red is explosions or some kind of remote violence, so bombing, shelling, that sort of thing. And then the green dots you can see are instances of violence against civilians. And all of this data is available online through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So you can also look at all the details of everything. So the other very, very interesting aspect of this war is that it's been called the most well-documented war that has happened, because all the technologies that we have and are using to our advantage to understand the scope of what is happening, and that's all available to us. That's been very useful in terms of understanding everything that's happening. We have also seen a lot of targeting of civilian infrastructure. So more than 1,300 schools have been attacked or destroyed. On the left is a sailing school for children in Odessa that was bombed just earlier this week. In the center is an example of a heritage site, a museum for the Ukrainian philosopher Skovoroda in his home village was bombed and many of the artifacts destroyed. And then, of course, attacks on healthcare facilities. You probably all remember the example of the maternity hospital in Mariupol that was bombed. 707 attacks on hospitals, healthcare workers, and medical infrastructures have been confirmed. Again, these are all numbers that have been confirmed and counted, but may be much higher. And this is part of this, bigger conceptualization of the human cost as not just being about people's actual death, but about these attacks on their communities, attacks on places that they live and work and play, and places that used to be safe for them. None of these places are safe anymore. And the attacks on these places of Ukrainian heritage and culture and intellectual life are also part of when we're conceptualizing things like war crimes and whether or not we should be calling this war a genocide. These attacks on Ukraine's cultural identity and heritage and history show that there's a kind of intent to destroy Ukraine's national identity. And that's a very important part, in addition to just damaging people's ability to live a normal life. So, of course, another very important component about the sort of human response is about mass force displacement. Since February of 2022, we've had 19 million people who have left Ukraine and crossed the border into Europe. Again, when we're talking about the numbers, this particular number assesses how many border crossings. So how many times people cross the border into somewhere else in Europe. That may or may not mean, it could be the same person who crossed 5 times, right? We're talking just about number of people who have moved on. But now we are getting a lot better evidence of people's more permanent locations. So what this map is showing us is the number of refugees in places that benefit, or the number of people who benefit from a protected status, so refugee status. And we also need to clarify that refugees are people who have left one country and are now living in another country and are therefore protected by an international order, not by Ukraine anymore. So you can see that Poland and Germany are the places that have received and given temporary protected status to the largest number of people. There are currently 5.8 million Ukrainians who are living in Europe as refugees. That's down. If you had come to one of my talks about 6 months ago, that number would have been much closer to 8 or 9 million people who were temporarily living abroad. But we're getting close to 5 million people who have returned from abroad, who have returned to Ukraine for one reason or another. Whether or not those people have actually returned to their homes, or if they're somewhere else in Ukraine, that's a separate part of the conversation. But this is the largest refugee displacement in the modern era since World War II. And so the kind of long-term impacts and what is going to happen with all of these refugees from Ukraine is a long-term question. There are also currently 271,000 refugees from Ukraine in the United States. That's a number as of February of 2023, so it may be a bit higher. It's certainly much lower than most places in Europe, but it's a lot bigger than it was. The US program was a little slow to develop and a little slow to accept a lot of Ukrainian refugees. So it's very good that there's more people getting temporary protected status here. Then the other side of the discussion of displacement has to do with internal displacement. So when we talk about internal displacement, this means people who have been forced to leave their homes but have not crossed an international border. And so by law or by practice, people who are internally displaced remain the responsibility of the state within which they live. So the Ukrainian government is responsible, technically speaking, for people who are displaced within Ukraine. So the International Office of Migration estimates about 5 million internally displaced people in Ukraine as of June of 2023. So the map on your left shows the density of displaced people. The darker purple is where most displaced people are. And so you can see that Ukraine is still following typical trends about displacement. Most people remain close to the front lines. They remain close to home. Even if people understand that their displacement isn't they don't really have an end date for their displacement, they are still inclined to stay somewhere closer to where they're coming from. But you can also see that central and western Ukraine, which are some of the safer parts of Ukraine, they have the next highest density for displaced people. And then in southern Ukraine, there's still some displaced people, but not as many. So you can see that, you know, the implications for these territories that have now hundreds of thousands of displaced people, how will they be able to build up their infrastructure to be able to take care of all of these new people? There's also particular risk for people who are elderly and people with disabilities. Their needs are different than, for instance, you know, a young person who worked for an IT company, speaks multiple languages, and can get a job wherever they want. And we know that Ukraine's displaced population is disproportionately elderly, female. That has been true for some time. On the right, I have a map of internally displaced people when the Ukrainian Ministry for Social Policy was counting between 2014 and 2015. So in response to the first invasion of Eastern Ukraine, there were about 1.5 million displaced people within the country then. And again, if you look, even if you don't read Ukrainian, you can see that the vast majority of them remained in the territories closer to the front lines. So these parts of Ukraine have already been dealing with building up a new infrastructure for displaced people. But again, these are places that are now experiencing a lot of hostilities, and they remain at very high risk. Just yesterday, there was another attack on the city of Zaporizhia, which has hosted thousands of displaced people. And I will also note that the official number of IDPs is that there are 3.6 million officially registered IDPs within Ukraine as of June 30th. And that basically means that not everybody who has been displaced is in fact officially registered as an IDP. That's just to say that these numbers are, you know, they're numbers and they're giving us kind of an idea of what's happening, but people are going to be missing in those assessments, and they're going to fall through the gaps in terms of having access to services and access to care. Certainly, we've all heard and talked about the unlawful deportation of children. This was something that a lot of scholars and researchers have been focusing on over the course of the summer. Kind of the first major intervention in this conversation was the Yale report from the Yale School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab, which identified 43 facilities across Russia that had been holding 6,000 children who had come from Ukraine. And so these were basically camps for children who had been taken out of Ukraine from the places that had been occupied and then placed in these camps for what they were calling re-education. Again, going back to this discussion of genocide, this is an act that's included in definitions of genocide. The re-education of children to make them become part of a culture that isn't the one that they're coming from is part of the attempt to destroy a national culture. And then we also heard quite a lot of stories about children who were being placed in foster families or who were being given up for what Russia was calling adoption, and being placed with families who wanted children. Ukrainian officials have identified 20,000 children who were unlawfully deported. They also think that this is a conservative figure. There's probably more. That's just the number that they've identified. But what's also very interesting about this part of the story is that this practice of unlawful deportation is a war crime. So there has been an arrest warrant issued for Vladimir Putin because of his participation in these deportations. And so it's very interesting to me that despite all the other kinds of evidence of war crimes that we have, this is the particular thing that has drawn a little bit more of a concrete position from international law. So just to give a little bit of an assessment of the scale and the kind of cost of destruction and damage, the Kyiv School of Economics is doing a great job assessing damage regularly using a lot of satellite technology. And their assessment is that the amount of damage that's been caused to infrastructure during the war has reached $151.2 billion, a number I can barely say because I can't even imagine the scope of what that actually is. Just here's two examples of two cities in eastern Ukraine that have been something like 90% destroyed, and they're not the only places that have faced this much damage. Some of Ukraine's most economically productive regions are also in eastern and southern Ukraine, and so those are the places that are experiencing the heaviest fighting. There's also been regular attacks on grain export facilities across the Black Sea, which damages Ukraine's grain export potential, which is a huge industry for Ukraine. The World Bank is estimating that $411 billion will be needed over the next 10 years to restore and reconstruct Ukraine's economy. So when we're talking about economic destruction and the potential, for people to come back to Ukraine, and the potential for Ukraine's economy to recover in some kind of near future, we're really talking about massive investments, not just in rebuilding housing, but also in rebuilding the economic infrastructure, schools, healthcare facilities, if we actually want people to be able to return home and also live the life that they are have the human right to live. I have to mention the term of ecocide as part of this. I know this is about the human cost of the war, but I also think kind of attention to the environment is a really important part of this war. You all remember in June of 2023, the dam at Novokakhovka was bombed or was damaged and destroyed, which caused massive flooding all through central Ukraine. This is an ecological catastrophe that experts are calling ecocide because it's basically these unique ecosystems around this area have been completely wiped out and will never be able to be brought back. So there were 3 national parks that were in this area that were completely damaged, and that's to say nothing about the other kinds of wildlife that lived here. The flooding that affected this part of the country impacted at least 80 settlements in this kind of low-lying area around the river. This was a village that was about 13 miles from the dam. It was actually already occupied by Russian forces when the dam exploded. And so those forces presumably were forced to retreat. Thousands of humans were evacuated, animals as well, but Russian bombing of evacuation points led to widespread death during that evacuation. Flooding also killed hundreds of thousands of animals, including the animals at the Kherson Zoo, which was flooded, and all of those animals couldn't be saved. And that's in addition, even in just this example, is another example of the destruction to cultural heritage. Polina Raiko was a kind of nativist, primitivist artist from Ukraine who had this spectacularly painted house in the region, and that house was flooded, and something like about 60% of the artwork was lost from that house. So all of this to say, as painful as it is to think about the extent of this damage and destruction, as I mentioned, this is considered to be the most documented war in history. And it isn't just global organizations that are documenting war crimes. It's it's regular people as well. And so that's part of why we have so much evidence of all of these different things that are happening. This is from the Ukrainian government's own website, which is giving us the same numbers that I gave earlier. This website is telling us that there are over 110,000 war crimes that have been registered, which again is just a huge number. And they're not the only. This is not the only place to find evidence of the documentation of war crimes. The Center for Civil Liberties, which is the organization that was the co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize last year, also has what's called a tribunal for Putin. That's documentation of war crimes. The organization Truth Hounds has carried out over 220 field missions to record 5,000 eyewitness testimonies. And the US Department of State also has its own conflict observatory to capture, analyze, and make available evidence of the war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. And as I mentioned before, this is a combination of using eyewitness testimony, people's own photo and video evidence, as well as open source and satellite imagery to get some of these kind of from above pictures, which have done things like help identify where mass graves are, for example. And so all of these organizations have been very carefully attending to how this evidence is collected to make sure that it will be admissible in a future trial against Vladimir Putin and those others who perpetrated war crimes. And it's also very, interesting and important that reconstruction has already begun. This is the town of Bucha, which was one of the first places that was occupied in the Kyiv region. This was the city, one of the first places that war crimes were documented. Many civilians were murdered by the Russian troops that came there. You probably have all seen the image on the left of these tanks littering the main street. This is the same street on the right-hand side. People came together to, clear it out, reconstruct this street. And that's part of what is making people want to come back to Ukraine. That's why there have been so many people who have returned from abroad, despite the fact that the war isn't over. It's very important that Ukraine's relationship with the EU continue to stay positive, because Ukraine's candidate status or membership status will affect what resources it can and can't access as part of its reconstruction. So institutions like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and other international financial institutions provide Ukraine with grants and loans. I've heard colleagues advocate for foreign direct investment, as well as other kinds of private capital investment that will help pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. But I also just want to throw out, Russian asset seizure. That's a possibility. Russia has a lot of foreign assets around the world. Theoretically, there are ways to basically take over those funds and use that money to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. You can imagine that Ukrainians tend to be very excited about that idea, although it would take a lot of work from international law for that to happen. But I will also say recent opinion polls are showing that around 80% of Ukrainians still support continuing the war until all of their occupied territory is retaken. And so what that means, I think, is that reconstruction will continue no matter how long the war goes. We'll see people focus on reconstruction, but the cost of reconstruction will continue to rise because there will be continued damage. So I finally just want to end with a little bit of attention to some of the projects that have been established to serve Ukrainians that are attending to both physical and mental health, giving attention to the widespread trauma in society that the war has caused. The Ukrainian First Lady has brought this How Are You program, which is the general mental health project, basically trying to do away with the stereotypes or the taboos around getting mental health care in Ukraine. If you go to this website, you'll see that a lot of this initiative is geared toward children, which I think is of course, children's trauma is really going to be a huge challenge in the future for Ukraine. I want to highlight the Superhuman Center, which is an organization which designs and produces prosthetics and also focuses on the physical rehabilitation of people who use prostheses, both civilians who have been injured as well as people from the armed forces. And then finally, the Human Rights Center Principle, which is an organization that is designed to help veterans and armed service people access resources that they are due because of their veteran or armed forces status. A good friend and colleague of mine has been working with this organization basically in response to this understanding that Ukrainian armed forces, as we've learned, there's probably going to be some 2 million veterans. People generally don't know how to access services. The bureaucracy around veteran status and veteran services is very opaque. So this organization is designed to help support people and help them understand what kinds of benefits they can get. So I want to leave you with a little bit of I don't know if positive assessment is the right thing, but just a kind of reminder that, despite all this destruction, despite this perpetual damage and destruction, Ukrainians are certainly responding to help one another. They're fighting for a better future for everyone. And I'm sure we'll see many more initiatives like these come out in the future. But I'm happy to take questions about whatever else you would like to discuss. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emily Channell-Justice. That was really amazing. So appreciated hearing your detailed overview of this war, and also ending on a good note. Really heartening to see that Ukrainians are beginning to return, that they are rebuilding even in the midst of continued bombardment. So thank you so much. A question that I had is that we all know that the Ukrainian language has gained significance as a key identifier of nationalism and is really a source of pride right now. However, the Russian language is and has been the first language for many Ukrainians. What is their attitude now towards Russian? Are they speaking Russian? Do they just go over to Ukrainian if they know Ukrainian? Just curious to know.
This is something that I have been discussing with my linguistic anthropology colleagues at length, because what most people have observed, now there haven't been very many very large scale surveys. It's a little bit too early for that, so that's fine. But all of us agree that what we've observed is a general shift to Ukrainian. So many of the people who participated in my research projects tended to be Russian language speakers. Almost all of them have been speaking in Ukrainian in terms of social media posts. When I see videos of them, they're doing interviews all in Ukrainian. So I have seen a lot of people, this includes people who I have never seen speak Ukrainian before. All of a sudden they're speaking Ukrainian. I have spoken to some folks who have said, you know, I made an active choice. I had to do some learning. My Ukrainian wasn't that strong, but I really wanted to show, you know, that I had changed my mentality. This is a big part of the conversation about colonialism in Ukraine. This kind of, the repression of the Ukrainian language by the Russian Empire, I mean, that's something that goes back hundreds of years. There's examples through the imperial period, in addition to during the Soviet period. And so the repression of language was certainly part of the process over history of Russia's claims on Ukraine that are again coming to the fore. So there's a lot of people who are thinking about taking on Ukrainian as an anti-colonial or decolonizing act. Now, that being said, there's also a position for people who advocate that a lot of European democracies are bilingual. And if we really want Ukraine to be a European-style democracy, then we have to figure out how to be a bilingual country without having this kind of colonial legacy of the Russian language. And so this is something where I'm sure some great linguistic anthropologists will be studying the kind of long-term effects, and I'm very much looking forward. But at the moment, I'm definitely anecdotally seeing much more of a switch to Ukrainian, which is something that I'm a Ukrainian speaker and not a Russian speaker. So for me, this is very welcome. And I think it's kind of a nice, you know, a nice embrace of an easily adopted cultural heritage that people you know, can feel kind of proactive about doing.
Yes, agreed. Thank you so much. You've spoken a lot about the demographic shifts, people coming, people going, internally displaced people. How challenging are these demographic shifts when we think about Ukraine's resiliency and survival as a forward-looking, Europe-focused society?
Excellent way of putting that. I think it's a little bit of a mixed response, because on the one hand, there are a lot of people who certainly want to stay in Ukraine because they feel themselves most effective by staying in Ukraine. So whether that means, you know, serving in the armed forces or, you know, doing humanitarian aid or advocating for Ukraine. But 600 days is a long time. That's a long war. And even people who stayed in Ukraine before might now start to consider, you know, at least some temporary sojourn somewhere else to get some rest from this experience of war. I know there are a lot of Ukrainians, especially, you know, younger people who were displaced from their university lives, for example, who are going to get degrees somewhere else, and no one would blame them for wanting to seek a university degree in peace. But I think the real question is, will they go back? And a lot of the folks that I have spoken to they say they want to. That's what they say. That's their sort of stated goal. We want to get this great education from somewhere else. We want to take it back and rebuild Ukraine. But because the end of the war is so indeterminable, it's really difficult to say when they will be able to go back, even if reconstruction has already happened. And so I think there's fears, not just that of things like a brain drain and highly educated people who are leaving and going to relocate somewhere else, but in terms of future generations of Ukrainians, where is their foundation going to come from? How many of them are going to be, starting new lives, starting families somewhere else? And what will that mean for the future of the territory of Ukraine, the citizens who live on that territory? Big open question.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that they're speaking with each other privately about this and not necessarily publicly? For instance, in our media, we hear, oh, we're so determined, we're going to fight on, we're going to get all of our land back, we're going to achieve victory. Is this kind of what you're hearing behind the scenes as well, even 600 plus days on and more?
Absolutely. I mean, it's, I think a lot of Ukrainians understand politically it's very important to present a very united front. I mean, think about what's happening in the US politics right now, right? Ukraine still needs more weapons. Mm-hmm. You can't, nobody wants to give millions of dollars worth of weapons to people who have lost interest in fighting. And I don't want to indicate that Ukrainians have lost interest. That's not at all what I mean. But this, I think there are some challenging discussions happening. What is the future of Ukraine really going to look like? People are tired of, having to survive like this. I think if anything, we could characterize it as just increasing frustration with Western allies for not doing something more definitive out of fear. Which is a criticism people had at the beginning as well, and it's totally valid. Certainly, most people still aren't advocating for something like U.S. intervention in Russia, but it's quite frustrating that Vladimir Putin is still able to do all the things that he does. Russian assets are still all over the place. Companies are still investing in Russia. Europe is still buying gas from Russia. All of these things, that would theoretically have more of a dramatic impact are still on the table and it's frustrating, I think, from the Ukrainian perspective, not to see more of a definitive reaction.
Mm-hmm. Well, are there also any maybe other elements of Ukrainian history or culture that have not yet been emphasized or come to the fore that you as a sociocultural anthropologist see that maybe we should be aware of?
Mm. Well, I think just in general, there's such a good conversation happening now about just how Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian identity have become, or over many years of historical scholarly study, collapsed into the idea that Ukraine and Russia are the same. And one thing that has happened in response to this war, I think, is that more of the world understands that Russia and Ukraine are not the same at all. And Ukrainians are doing an absolutely phenomenal job of platforming themselves so that people who don't speak Ukrainian have something from Ukraine to consume. So they're, promoting Ukrainian artistic traditions, for example. I always like to talk about the artists that I mentioned. Again, who, like I said, Maria Primachenko is one of the other artists who is of this kind of naive kind of folk tradition. The museum housing, most of her artwork was bombed earlier in the war. I mean, these are attacks on Ukrainian culture that Ukrainians are also now rallying around in a way that even someone like me, I hadn't really heard of these artists before, and now I know all about them. There has been such a push to translate Ukrainian literature. So much of the conversation, so much of the interest in Russia is Russian literature, this great literary tradition. Ukraine also has a great literary tradition. It's not really our fault, sitting here in the US that we don't know most of it. It's because publishers don't think Ukrainian translations are going to sell, right? But now there's so much interest in Ukrainian authors. And so publications programs, including our program here at the Ukrainian Research Institute, is focused on producing culture from Ukraine that can be consumed in a non-Ukrainian audience. And I find that really admirable. People are really, they understand that it isn't just about, today's response, but it's about kind of recreating the legacy of what it means, what Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian cultural heritage really mean so that people have a longer term understanding of what that is.
Thank you. Thank you. Just one last question, and then I'll go to some questions in the chat. According to the USDA in 2021, Ukraine's agricultural exports accounted for 41% of its overall exports. What is the long-term impact of Russia's invasion on its agricultural output and farming as a livelihood for thousands of Ukrainians, and also including the fact that about an area about the size of Florida has now been mined by Russian armies. So, and making about 10% of agricultural lands unserviceable. So if you could just speak to that, and then we'll go to the chat for questions.
Yeah, I think this is one of those unfortunate aspects that we might sort of understand the situation, but we are going to see the effects for years. That's how important, both in terms of Ukraine's economy, but also in terms of the global food supply. So, I don't know if it's possible to measure what those effects will be in the long term, but the damage to the potential kind of regrowth of Ukraine's economy is really important here. Because obviously Ukraine's agricultural production is limited and less mines can be taken care of. And I mean, obviously the demining efforts are focused on the front lines right now. So it's a very deep and big question for the Ukrainian agricultural sector. But then, I mean, who in the world is going to fill that gap being left by the Ukrainian agricultural sector? The impact on other places around the world that are already places that experience food insecurity, that's also going to be something that continues in the long term. I fear that that's something, let's say Ukraine completely wins the war and Russia deoccupies its territories tomorrow. Farmers can't just, okay, here's what we made up. And if Russia keeps also bombing grain storage facilities, for example, the damage to the sector is very large. And we'd have to ask some experts on agricultural production to see if it is actually measurable in some way. But I think it's probably really difficult to estimate just how long and how much that impact is going to be.
Thank you. So we do have some questions here, quite a few actually. We'll see what we can get through in the next 12 or 13 minutes. Someone would like to know, how is the Ukrainian educational system bearing up with the domestic dislocations of so many young people?
Yeah, this is something that's been so interesting to me. As someone who has done a lot of research in the higher education sector. So interestingly enough, many people have decided to continue their education in Ukrainian, and the infrastructure for distance education already existed because it was built during the pandemic. So a lot of kids for instance, in Poland, do their classes remotely. I was just in Canada and I met a guy, university student, who's getting his degree in Kyiv. He's like, oh, I'm just still enrolled in my university in Kyiv. I just take my classes online. He wants to get his degree from a Ukrainian institution. So this is something that I have found very interesting, that I think is a way that especially teenagers and kind of young people who are still in education, but who are very much able to make their own decisions, they are feeling kind of remaining connected to Ukraine in that way. There's been there's a huge conversation that's happening now about safety too. Schools need to be equipped with bomb shelters so that if kids are coming to schools in person, that they have a safe place to go. That's a big part of the future rebuilding and reconstruction of communities as a whole. I'm also very interested in internal displacement. How are schools going to accommodate these thousands of new children in these smaller communities that didn't used to have a lot of young people in them? There has to be a kind of reconfiguring in terms of Ukrainian education in that sense. A couple of other things to say though, for kids who are refugees who are integrating into other school systems. So in Poland and Germany, for example, those educational systems have worked hard to integrate Ukrainian refugee students. And in places like Poland, I have heard a lot of kind of positive success stories of younger kids who are quickly able to master the language, find some sort of social group, and continue their education in Poland. And so that's another place where I'm very curious to see, are those kids going to eventually go back to Ukraine? Are they going to become, Ukrainian expatriates in Poland for the longer term? Again, and I, to be fair, I've also had other stories of kids who are doing both of them, virtual school in Ukraine and real life school in Poland, and just trying to balance everything. So it's a huge challenge, but it's a very important part, obviously, of sustaining, Ukraine's future.
And actually, Ukrainian and Polish do have similarities, correct? Do you know approximately what percentage of words, or you compare their grammar quickly, anything like that?
They're both Slavic languages. There is a lot of overlap in terms of, I would say, vocabulary and sort of general grammatical structure. I wouldn't want to guess about the percentage of overlap, because I'll probably get it wrong, because each, Russian and Ukrainian have some overlap in Russian and Polish, and Ukrainian and Polish and Czech, and there's a lot. But we can definitely say that Polish would be easier for a Ukrainian kid to master than German or French, for instance. So and a lot of Poles understand a fair amount of Ukrainian too. So we can also, that integration into Polish education is absolutely going to be, easier linguistically for kids than somewhere else.
Okay. In the face of continued uncertainty, what are realistic paths to true labor market growth within Ukraine, since this is an urgent concern for people within the country who are currently unemployed, or those who are currently supporting them from abroad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question, difficult question. Well, one of the things that I think, one of the important economic sectors in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion was the growth of the IT sector. Ukrainian IT is actually, it was one of the biggest in Europe, but also in the world, and kind of considered favorably in comparison to other places of IT development. One of the big benefits of IT work is that it can easily be remote work. And so people can work from anywhere. But the question is, Ukrainians bringing money into Ukraine and then investing that money into things in Ukraine and into the Ukrainian economy, right? If we have a bunch of Ukrainian IT workers who are now living in Poland and they're making their money in Poland, that's not doing the same thing. So, that's something, though, that people who are internally displaced, for example, can continue to keep that economy in Ukraine. I think if we're talking about the reconstruction sector, this is something that I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around as a place for economic growth, hiring Ukrainians to do the reconstruction work of Ukraine, and also the sort of infrastructural building to accommodate displaced people who, maybe they're from Bakhmut, a city that was 90% destroyed. They're not going back to Bakhmut anytime soon. Let's help rebuild the communities that they're living in. Make that a kind of central part of the investment in the Ukrainian economy. I would also, for those types of reasons, I'm a little cautious about some of these, bigger funding schemes or large amounts of, private foreign investment coming to try to do some sort of intervention. I think there needs to be some kind of relationship with the Ukrainian government to make sure that funding follows regulations that will benefit the most Ukrainians, and not just be these temporary investments that then don't actually help strengthen the economy in the long term. But again, people who know much more about this than I do have said we need to be looking 10 to 20 years in the future when we're talking about this. It's not a next year conversation. So yeah. I hope that addresses that a little bit.
Thank you. I hope too that they keep in mind people that are perhaps 50 and older, who going into IT is just not an option.
And going into physical reconstruction is not an option for those people too.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, has there been any talk for reconstruction? I know there are lots of amputees, and that handicapped access in Soviet, post-Soviet countries is, I would say, almost non-existent based on my travels. So has that become part of the conversation at all?
Yes, it has. Yesterday I attended a seminar that was precisely about this, and it was with a Ukrainian disability advocate who was talking specifically about the need for reconstruction to address accessibility in an absolutely much better way, or in a way at all, as you rightly say. There's really not much going on. It's an interesting, one of those interesting things where I do think it would be good for Ukraine to become more accessible. It's terrible that it's going to take such a dramatic shift in society for that to happen. But the fact that accessibility is a huge task, it needs to be a fundamental part of reconstruction. And it needs broad social support, and it needs, people who need accessibility need to not be ostracized as having, needs that are too hard to meet. Those needs need to be prioritized. So I am really hoping that these advocates who I have heard from are being listened to at the kind of higher levels, the actual levels of decision making. And I think that's likely. Just, if you have a society of 40 million or so people and 2 million of them are veterans, you are going to need to address this question of accessibility. It's just sort of, it's and just to add though, I've thought a lot about people with disabilities and how difficult it is to evacuate them from the front lines, for example. That's a big issue. Even accessibility framed around the veteran population is going to help a lot of people in Ukraine. So I think in the long term, this is a really positive thing to come out of something that's obviously terrible.
Yeah. One of our first questions states, we have seen in recent days the UN humanitarian efforts in Gaza. What has been the role of the UN in Ukraine as it pertains to humanitarian work?
Yes, that has actually been one of the bigger disappointments in this particular invasion. Pretty common stories from at least from early February of 2022 was that these major humanitarian organizations were not present in Ukraine and were not present at the borders when thousands, millions of refugees were fleeing. Now, I mentioned the displacement from 2014 to 2021. There were international organizations on the ground in Ukraine who were supporting displaced populations then. I worked with some people from UN Women, for instance, people who worked with USAID programs. So it's not as if these organizations have no experience in the country, but because of the way these large organizations work, they did not have emergency programs for Ukraine. So they were unable to meet people's needs immediately. I spoke to people who were at the Polish border in beginning of March of 2022, and they sent pictures of IOM tents totally empty, but small rural Polish women's organizations were on the border handing out bottles of water and sandwiches to people so that they could eat something. So for those of us who are able to think a little bit critically about what we're learning from all of this, one of the things is about aid. It's about humanitarian response. It's this notion that these large organizations don't have the capacity to meet 21st century crises. These are unexpected and unprecedented, and ordinary people are actually filling a lot of the gaps. I think this humanitarian response in Gaza is something that's going to be another part of that conversation. What is happening there, and how is that going to change how we have changed the way we think about humanitarianism in response to Ukraine? How do we go forward from there in response to further crises?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I would just like to say that if anyone here, if it's part of your humanitarian work or just your heart, if you want to help the people of Ukraine, one way that you can do that is by learning Ukrainian. So we at the Critical Languages Institute have a summer intensive program. So if you are 16 and over and motivated, please consider coming to us. If you thought maybe I should learn Ukrainian so that I can actually be of more help. Really in whatever field you're in. So I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Emily Channell-Justice, and it's been wonderful. Your insights are just incredible. I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
Thank you so much for the questions, Teresa.